Good afternoon, everyone. I was just giving folks another couple minutes to join the meeting, but we can go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon session on technical assistance during PARCC and DC Science testing. We'll also be covering a section on test sessions in PAN, in addition to how you can get technical assistance from ussie during testing. My name is Stephanie Snyder. I'm the Interim Director of Assessments here at ussie. And I will turn it to my colleagues to introduce themselves. Chelsea, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Chelsea Charland. I'm the DC Science and DLM Assessment Specialist, and I will be facilitating a large portion of this meeting today.
And Yolanda?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Yolanda Barber. I am the Assessment Specialist for Mathematics, specifically working with the PARCC assessment this year.
Thanks, Yolanda. I'm dropping in the chat a link for the sign-in sheet for today, and I will continue to drop that in throughout the meeting, but want to make sure that you are clicking that and filling it out so that we can record that you were all here today. As a reminder, if you are not speaking, please mute your microphone and also turn off video to preserve bandwidth and the quality of the recording, because we are recording this meeting. You can go to the next slide, Chelsea. I wanted to give a brief overview of the things that we're going to discuss today. One thing that the assessment team always starts meetings off is just an introduction or an overview of statewide assessments in DC. As a refresher, I'm sure many of you have seen that spiel before, but just wanted to make sure that we are providing all the information to our stakeholders. Excuse me. The next thing we'll cover is test session information for PARCC and DC Science. Chelsea will walk us through creating test sessions in PAN and some best practices to consider as you're doing that. Then we'll talk about supports that ussie provides during testing in order to be able to ensure that you have a successful administration. So we'll go over some resources that you can use during testing and also ways to get in touch with us if you need some additional support, including resources for using the test administration platform, PAN, resources for reporting any incidents or deviations from your school test security plan, and other just general ways to get in contact. Next slide. Oh, and then of course we'll have time for questions and answers, but you can also feel free to drop any questions that you have in the chat as we go along, and we'll be sure to answer them as we are presenting, but there will be plenty of time at the end for questions. To start, a brief introduction to statewide assessment in DC. As you all are aware, being here, PARCC and DC Science are the general statewide assessments for ELA, math, and science in the District of Columbia. PARCC is administered for grades 3 through 8 and high school, and then DC Science is grades 5, 8, and high school, specifically high school biology. Other statewide assessments include NAEP, WIDA Access for English Language Learners, which is our English Language Proficiency Assessment, and then MSAA and DLM are our alternate assessments in ELA, math, and science. Next slide. Brief reminder of the testing windows. We are actively in the windows for both Access for ELLs and MSAA and DLM as of yesterday. So I'm sure that there has been or is currently some testing going on in your LEAs, but perhaps not necessarily under your purview as the PARCC and DC Science coordinators, but just flagging that the spring assessment administration season is well underway. And we thank you for all of the preparations and your work to ensure that folks are ready to take those assessments this spring. Next slide. Just a reminder of a few resources for statewide assessments in DC. The test security forms and guidelines are posted on USSI's test security webpage, and there you will find things like ways to report incidents, testing incidents that happen. You'll also find a exemplar school test security plan, as well as instructions for filling out the school test security plan. It's very important that those plans are created and approved by ussie before LEAs start testing. So if you submit your school test security plan and you have questions about its status as whether it's approved or not, please reach out to us before any testing happens, because the Testing Integrity Act in DC does require that all schools have an ussie approved school test security plan prior to starting testing. The assessment participation and performance policy is also posted on our website and has been around since October, November, and gives guidance on who is expected to participate in PARCC and, well, in all statewide assessments, but of particular interest may be the information surrounding PARCC and DC Science participation. And then lastly, our test coordinator resources page provides what we attempted to make a one-stop shop for test coordinators, which has information on assessment-specific guidance and resources to help you plan out your administration, and also a link to the test administration training schedule for this year, although we are getting toward the end of training season. So there are a number of other resources that I would encourage you to take a look at on that page to help as you plan out administration in your schools. Next slide. I'm now going to pass it over to Chelsea to talk through setting up test sessions in Pearson Access Next PAN and providing some tips and guidance as you're working through that.
Thanks, Stephanie. Once again, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we will pause briefly to address any questions that come up and allow us the opportunity to give voice to a lot of these questions. So as Stephanie said, we're going to talk over some test session information. As a reminder, PARCC and DC Science are managed through our Pearson Access Next system, otherwise known as PAN. Students will be taking our PARCC and DC Science assessments online in TestNav 8. A note here that for those of you who are testing students on Apple products, you have to make sure that the iOS is 15.2 or higher. This probably should not be an issue, as the current release is 15.3.1. If you have any questions about what devices are supported and which operating systems we need to use, they are all listed in the requirements section on the Pearson support site. And this presentation will also be linked on our test coordinator resource page, and we'll have links to all of the resources we utilize throughout this training towards the end of the session as well. So just to go over what test sessions are, so these are groupings of students who take the same test at the same time and the same place. There is a little caveat here where we do allow some students to be grouped together, even though they might be taking different units of the same subject test, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But students that are in the same session should be receiving the same accommodations as they're testing in the same location. Students are all going to be assigned to test sessions, and then those test sessions are then assigned to test administrators. So again, if you have different sessions testing in the same room, because maybe students are grouped together, say for example, grade 6, grade 7 are both taking ELA Unit 1, you would have 2 different sessions going at one time, both assigned to the same test administrator for that location, and they would be able to monitor those sessions at the same time in PAN. So test session creation. There's 2 different methods to creating test sessions. The first is to do it through the SRPNP upload. We've talked in detail about the SRPNP document. If you have any questions about what that document looks like or where to find the template or field definitions guide, let us know, but those are all on the Pearson support page. So session name is column AS. You'll also notice that you have the test administrator column AU, which is also useful when assigning sessions. You can also create test sessions manually through the PAN interface. For this, you would have to go into your setup bar window and click on testing and sessions. and you'll be able to create test sessions manually and be able to assign students to those sessions through the manual interface. Something that's important to note is that if you create sessions or have test administrators in sessions that are no longer required, maybe those sessions were created in error, or we've now determined we no longer need a particular session, the SRPMP will not override student session information or test administrator information. What you'll have to do is go in and delete the sessions manually, remove the students manually, and you can upload a brand new SRPMP file to update the session registration for students, or you can just remove them manually and add them into a different session individually through the PAN interface. We've included the standard naming convention for sessions in our presentation today. This is very important when you are using when you're trying to submit your school test security plans. There is a standard naming convention for both test administrator and session columns. So when we are looking over your school test security plans, we export your SRPMP for your organization to ensure that these columns are completed according to the naming convention. The test administrator convention is just your last name dot first name. You can see the example here. If you have test administrators with the same initials, they would have pretty much the same session name, except that there would be a number after the initials to differentiate between two test administrators with the same initials. You can see here session names always start with the subject, followed by the grade, your test administrator initials, and whether it is a regular session designated by an R or a makeup session designated by an M. And again, as a reminder, these columns are required as part of your school test security plan review and approval process through ussie. So while you may not have updated that information initially, you will have to eventually go back and update that information for all the students registered for assessments for this academic year. As an aside, if you are trying to create session names for high school level courses, it's a slightly different naming convention, obviously because of the course designation. So you'll have to do math followed by algebra 1, for example, or geometry in place of the grade level. That also is the same for science. You would use biology. And for ELA, you would just have ELA, since all of those different grade sessions are pretty much the same. As a reminder that students who are absent from a test must complete the test at a later date within the school test window. Makeup session location and dates should be outlined in your school test security plan. We understand, obviously, things come up that we always can't account for. So if you do have some minor deviations from your plan, that can be documented at the end of your school test security plan in the minor deviations column. If there were some testing days that were switched due to student absence, illness, things like that. You also have to remember that makeup sessions can be grouped by grade and test subject in the PAN system. We can have students of different grades taking different tests in the same room. And this is outlined in our guidance on student groupings document in our administration resource page for Pearson. And there's also further documentation for makeup session directions located again on the administration resource page for Pearson. So now we're going to move on to PAN test session management. So when you're managing student tests in PAN, there's a couple different things that you are able to access and things that will need to happen before you're able to administer tests. So you'll be able to start student testing sessions and also importantly, unlock student testing sessions, restart, stop, and lock sessions once students have completed assessments. You can also transfer and transcribe student tests through the PAN interface. And again, all of these directions can be found on the Pearson Support assessment site. So I'm just going to go through a couple different screenshots here of what some of these different session preparation and management looks like. So here is a shot of PAN. We have our student in sessions highlighted here. So this step allows us to assign forms for each student based on their SRPMP information. This is why it's very important to make sure that your SRP&P information is accurate, so that when you are going to prepare your sessions, the forms that are assigned to students are an accurate representation of the accommodations they need for assessments. I will say you will not be able to select prepare session until March 30th. That's when the ability for that will be unlocked in PAN. So you have up until that moment to make sure that all the IEP documentation is accurate and that your SRP&P information is updated to reflect that. You'll also be able to see, oh, sorry.
Yeah, Chelsea, before we move on, can we go back to that slide? I just wanted to tease out a little bit what we mean by preparing sessions versus actually setting up sessions. So you are able now to go in and set up test sessions to group your students appropriately for testing. But the prepare session feature is an additional step that is done right before testing starts, just to put the session in kind of ready mode, basically, for administration. So you should be now going in and creating test sessions, but just note that that prepare session to actually take that next step to put it in ready status will not be available until March 30th.
Thanks, Stephanie. This is a reminder too that once you are creating your sessions, that you will need to go in and print your student testing tickets for all of the sessions and all the students that are assigned to those sessions. It's also important to note that student test tickets are secure testing materials. They can only be in a locked cabinet or drawer and possession in authorized personnel before and after testing. So this is essentially very important when you are turning in materials after administration is complete for the day. You want to make sure, according to your chain of custody form, that all student testing tickets that were assigned to that testing location and distributed in the morning are returned in the afternoon so that they can be securely destroyed. Any missing testing tickets would be an incident report that could be filed through QuickBase.
And Chelsea, I'd like to just pause for a minute. There's a couple of questions coming through the chat I want to make sure we address. I'm going to start with the question from Yale Haynes. So in the past, they have not moved students to new sessions in PAN for makeups unless they missed all the units for that session. They did rolling makeups of those students during the window using the sessions that they were assigned to regularly. And they'd like to know if that is an allowable practice. So the answer is yes. Students do not need to be moved into a specific makeup session in order to make up the assessments. Some LEAs do prefer to do that, but students can be tested in the session that they missed at a later date. You just aren't able to close out the session until that student has completed the test. And then going back up, there's a question about if bulk corrections need to be made to student accommodations in the P&P section, will the corrections override the updates, or will corrections need to be made using the user interface? And I'm not entirely clear on the question. If corrections need to be made to student accommodations, that can happen via an SRP&P upload. If you need to make bulk corrections to test sessions, that's something that is slightly different. And I don't believe that that can be done through the SRP&P upload, but Chelsea, correct me if there's some nuance there that I'm missing.
Correct. So you cannot bulk change test administrators or test session names through an SRP&P upload. And that is contained in the field definitions guide and some important definitions before you even get into the minutia of the guide. But you can use the SRP&P to change the accommodations, not the test sessions. That's correct. Yeah. So you would be better off just going in and deleting any students out of test sessions and then removing that test session completely if it's not being used for your LEA. And then if the student does not have a new session assigned, you can then do a mass import of SRP&P. Just say maybe correct a class or correct a test administrator or a session name, things like that. All right. So getting into managing your student sessions, you can see in the screenshot here that you have to click the Start Session button in PAN for each of your selected sessions that you're trying to administer for that day. It's also important to note too that when you're looking at your test session screen, you can see this example here. There's several different units for this session, and at this current rate, they are all locked. So you want to make sure when you're trying to administer tests that you unlock the testing unit prior to the students logging in. Only one session unit can be unlocked at a time, and you have to make sure that all of the different sections are locked once students have submitted their tests. This part is especially important if you are trying to administer tests first thing in the morning and you're trying to figure out why aren't any of the testing information showing up on my students' computers. It could just be that the sessions were not unlocked after you hit Start section. So you just want to make sure that you're hitting your Start Session button and then also going in and manually unlocking the units as needed. And here you could see different descriptions of students and what their active status is. This hasn't changed from year to year, and they are still color-coded the same. So we have ready, and they have not yet taken their test. And then we have active is when they've logged in and started. Exited is when they've exited TestNav but not yet submitted their test responses. So then that will be a situation in which you need to go in or a test administrator needs to go in and manually resume testing. Resumed then will be the status where they've been authorized to resume testing. Then we have resumed upload. And here, if any responses were saved locally, let's say internet or Proctor caching issues, those responses can be uploaded when the student is ready to continue testing. We have completed, where the student has submitted their test through TestNav and it's been processed. And then marked complete is when your test administrator or school test coordinator marks the test complete when they've exited TestNav. And this is your final action when you know for sure that the student will not be returning to the TestNav system. I have another question in the chat. Says there's a new test coordinator here. If we have our student rosters uploaded already, in order to add the accommodations, we would just upload another spreadsheet into PAN with the accommodations listed now. Bethany, you are correct. You can actually very easily do a student registration export for your organization. It'll include all your students that are currently rostered or enrolled in your LEA and all of their demographic information. And then you should be able to go through those different columns for your personal needs and preferences section and add all of the necessary documentation there, and then upload that file as a student registration import, and then you should be able to update your accommodations that way. Oh, Stephanie just answered. You're welcome. All right, so there's some troubleshooting that we can get into. So you are able to resume a student test in PAN, which I did describe earlier. You can see in this screenshot, there's a little red square that does say exited. So in this case, you know, a test administrator or school test coordinator needs to go in and manually adjust this test again so that the student is able to get back into the session. You want to make sure that the student is on the same testing device if you're attempting to do this. The responses that the student may have entered before they exited the test, whether by accident or outside of their control, are not saved locally on a computer unless predetermined. So if you have them try to log into a different testing device after they've accidentally exited, you're not going to save any of that progress. So it's important to have the student log in again on the same testing device. And if the same error occurs repeatedly, or it's affecting multiple students, you may have to contact your technology coordinator. That way you can get some troubleshooting and they could potentially escalate that issue to Pearson customer support. So not all problems that you may encounter during testing are necessarily errors. There are some expected behaviors that are outlined in our TestNav expected behaviors document that's also on that Pearson support site to help users who encounter problems with TestNav that are different than what's anticipated or do not appear to be working properly. So some of the expected behaviors or non-critical limitations could be that the notepad can't be resized or the exhibit cannot be resized. Things like copy paste are not accessible. Questions may appear not answered unless all parts of the question are actually answered. Or say, for example, the magnifier tool will not magnify. So a lot of these expected behaviors are things that are built into the TestNav system. And again, you could see on the error code site how to deal with these expected behaviors before you need to contact any sort of customer support. There's also operational reports in PAN, which are extremely useful for each individual LEA. This allows you to see which PNP reports are completed for students in your LEA. You can see which students have an online test, but they're not assigned to sessions yet. So it could be that you're still working on test administrators or session names. You can pull a quick report and see that there's certain students that are registered to be assessed at your LEA, but do not have sessions or test administrator names. And tests that have been assigned, but have not yet been completed. So that last one is very useful, especially when you get a little bit further into your testing window, just as an overview of students who have completed testing, which units have been completed, and students that maybe need to make up these units because of multiple absences. So I will pause here for a moment for any other questions. You can feel free to take yourself off mute or put that question in the chat. All right. So I'm going to turn it over to Yolanda to talk about the test administration support.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. So we're going to get into the ways that we're available for support during the administration of PARCC and DC Science. Take a look at this screen. It details all of the different ways that you, or all of the different reasons rather, that you may reach out to ussie for support. So we are here to answer participation questions. If there are questions or updates to your school test security plan, if you need to request a medical exemption, if there was an emergency accommodation that's needed, if you need to reopen a student test, if there is an issue with a test where there was wrong accommodations and you need to reissue that test, and then also to report any large-scale testing issues or to report an incident. There are two different ways that you can contact us. The first is the ussie support tool, and during administration, we really do request that you submit your request via OST. If you're unable to do that, there is also an ussie assessment hotline. That hotline is for emergencies. So again, if there's anything else that you need to communicate or report to us, please use the ussie support tool. It is the most efficient way for us to get back to you and for you to include all of the information that we will likely need. So now that we are back in person with administering this test, yay! In the last 2 years, we are also doing ussie monitoring. So ussie staff will visit schools to monitor the administration of PARCC and DC Science to ensure that everyone is compliant with our testing policies and regulations. As a reminder, ussie monitors are not able to provide any feedback or carry on just general conversation around assessments while they are at the school. If you have any questions about monitoring or if you have any questions about the assessments in general, then you should reach out directly to the ussie assessment team. And the monitoring forms can be found on the ussie Test Security website. So if you would like to see what those forms are that all monitors will have, please visit that site. All right, now I'm getting into reporting incidents, concerns, and deviations. So once your school test security plan is approved, you will note that at the bottom of that plan is a section for any minor deviations. Minor deviations to the testing plan include a change in personnel, minor time changes, or changes in the information that were presented in the approved test plan. Usually we see this when you need to change your test schedule. So if maybe you had a proctor or a test admin who was absent on a particular day and you subbed in someone else, that would be a minor deviation to your plan. You would make that change in your test schedule, and then you would re-upload that test schedule to your test security plan. There's also the test security file. So the test security file should house all of your test security or integrity incidents. Additionally, test administration concerns not resulting in a breach of the security or test materials, test content, or testing devices can also be housed there. Last, an incident report. So again, this is what we're asking. If there is an incident, to report that you're using OST in order to report it. All breaches to test security and integrity during test administration. And if there are any issues with accommodations where a student was given accommodations that they were not supposed to receive, or if a student was not given the appropriate accommodations, that would also be reported as an incident. So just to go through a little deep dive, this is when you should submit an incident report. When a student becomes ill or injured and cannot complete testing they have already started, a student or staff member is in possession of a cell phone or unauthorized device in an active testing environment, staff or students take actions that could constitute as cheating or coaching, students or staff are in possession of materials that could constitute as cheating, secure testing materials are lost or left unsupervised, student does not receive the appropriate accommodations, all students must leave the testing environment due to an emergency or drill, and a technical issue causes students to not complete an active test session before the close of a school day. So anytime there's basically an interruption to testing that's going to result in that test not being completed during that session, you would want to submit an incident report. Let's also go through what you do not need to document with an incident report. So any technical issues that cause minor delays in testing for a student or for a group of students, but you do want to include that in your test security file. Assigning a student a different device during testing. So if that device is not working and the student is completely logged out and you give them another computer, that is not an incident report, but it should be noted and kept in file. Student behavior that does not disrupt a test session or interfere with that student's or other students' ability to complete the test session. That again should also be kept in your test security file. And substituting test administrators and or proctors, again, that is a test plan update and that would be a minor deviation. So that does not need to be submitted as an incident. So there are two ways that you can submit an incident. One, again, is using the ussie support tool, which is via QuickBase, OST. And the second is an ussie incident reporting form, which anyone can do. And you should be including hard copies of those ussie incident reporting forms in your materials when you're giving them to test administrators. If possible, we would prefer that you submit incidents again via OST. Lastly, updates or deviations to the school test plan. Again, at the bottom of your school test security plan, you will see a section for this where you can list any minor deviations that you may have had. There's also a document that says plan to improve test plan document. This is a required document that explains your school's plan for correcting issues described in the initial incident report. So anytime that there is an incident or anything that you need to report, you, along with the rest of your planning team, your assessment team, should be thinking of ways that you can improve that. Then there's also a fact-finding inquiry document. That is a required document that provides IC with additional information about the incident reported to determine if there are any additional steps that are required. Both of these documents can be found embedded in your test plan, and both would need to be uploaded back to the plan for record keeping purposes. All of these require action. So if IC requests last documents, you are required to complete them and then return them to us within 24 hours of the request. It's essential for us to get this information in a timely manner so that if there are any additional next steps required, we can make them without disrupting testing too much. I'm going to turn it back over to Chelsea for resources. Are there any questions
I was going to say,
around the
Yolanda,
support that's available?
there is one question, 2 questions. So the first question is, if our window is, for example, April 4th through the 15th, we don't need to change our test security plan as long as we test anywhere within that window and are not changing the window itself, correct? Yeah, so Catherine, if your test window, say for example, you're administering your PARCC assessment from April 4th through the 15th, the only thing that you would need to do is document a minor deviation if, for example, a session that you had planned on the 6th did not occur until the 7th, or you have a new makeup session to do because there may have been an unforeseen administration issue, such as like a fire drill or inclement weather. So you wouldn't need to submit a plan to change or to document any sort of window change, because your window would likely not be changing. Just the individual sessions might change, the dates that they're administered, and that would just be a minor deviation. That would not be an entire incident. And then there's another question from Victoria. Some clarification needed regarding the plan to improve and fact-finding document. Are those required for all reported incidents? That would be a new requirement. That is not required for all incidents. So normally when an incident is documented in OST, a member of ussie reviews the incident report and determines if there are any next steps that need to be taken, what those next steps should be. Sometimes an incident is put into OST and we just document the receipt of your incident and ask that you document it in your school test security file. Other times there may be an incident that is reported that does require more detailed information provided to ussie. That is when a school would be provided a fact-finding inquiry document or would have a plan to improve test plan document provided to them. So it is not required, but they can be documents that need to be completed and submitted to ussie to just further document the details needed. You're welcome. I have another question from Natalie. When reporting minor deviations, all we have to do is update the test plan, correct? Yes, Natalie. So you'll notice on the bottom of your school test security plan, there's a minor deviation section. That is where you can document those minor deviations, and you can also attach new, say for example, test schedule plans. If the test schedule is what changed, you can update a new Excel document into your school test security plan. So it would all be documented in there. You are correct. Any other questions before we move on to some resources? All right, thank you again, Yolanda. So I'm just going to go through some resources here, and a lot of these have been mentioned prior in this presentation, but this is a nice little way to kind of house everything together that kind of goes together. So there are several PARCC and DC Science resources available to test coordinators and test administrators. Obviously, our Pearson Access Next testing platform is our huge resource. There we do have a lot of support documentation, such as our field definitions guide for your SRPMP. It also links to a lot of different other resources through the Pearson Assessment Portal. There's also the My Pearson Support DC site, and this has a little bit more useful resources, things that you probably will access more frequently, such as the guide for students testing in different grades in the same locations. The guide there is very useful because then it lets you know that certain grades cannot be tested together because the scripts for the test administrator manuals are a little bit too different. We also have a variety of training modules, testing manuals that are all accessible through the PARCC DC Science site. And then we also have our customer support and ussie hotline here. Just a reminder, please do not use the ussie hotline unless you're experiencing some sort of emergency while you're attempting to administer assessments in that moment. If you find that you are experiencing some difficulties with other aspects surrounding administration, we ask that you use the ussie support tool. You can also do the Microsoft bookings with a member of the ussie staff. And of course, you can also email the ussie.assessment@dc.gov inbox, and somebody will get back to you or forward your email to the appropriate person to help with your issue. So here is the Pearson DC support page for those of you that have not seen it. This is where you can access all of your manuals and a lot of your training videos, as well as the additional guides and supports that you need during administration. So like I said, here's your training manuals. We also have previous OSSI-led trainings found on the OSSI Test Coordinator resource page. So it's a little bit of scrolling, but if you get a little bit further down under the PARCC DC Science Administration header, you'll see previous trainings that we've had, links to the PDF, and recorded webinar if one exists. So the PowerPoint for this workshop, as well as the recorded training, will live on this site. Just a little aside, this screenshot had not been updated, but that March 10th webinar was canceled and it was rolled into this presentation on March 15th. So you should not see a March 10th DC Science PARCC test session workshop, because we realized that the information was very similar to today, so we just made it all happen today. So the March 15th Technical Assistance during PARCC and DC Science will be uploaded there within the next couple days. And there's also going to be a link in the slide where you can see future trainings. I will say we are close to the end of our training season. There is one more on May 12th, and that is the PARCC and DC Science Assessment Closeout Procedures. And then after that, we will have our NGA meeting, and that's going to be the end of the administration season. So as always, you can access Pearson Access Next for their direct customer support line. This is really useful when you're trying to troubleshoot error codes that are not expected behaviors in TestNav 8. And then you have your direct TestNav 8 support as well. You can see here expected behaviors and error codes are linked directly under the troubleshooting section of this site. And this is just a close-up of the manuals that we offer on the DC Science and PARCC Pearson site. So you can see you can actually download your test administrator and test coordinator manuals now. Those are not secured documents. So if you wanted to print extra copies or provide those manuals to your test administrators so they get an idea of what administration will look like in their different locations, that is something that you can do in this moment. So I'm going to see if anybody has any additional questions. I don't see anything else in the chat, but feel free to unmute yourselves if you'd like to ask a question regarding anything. Oh, I do have a question here. Tech coordinator here. When testing the infrastructure, how are sample sessions and students created and used? How soon can infrastructure tests begin? So if you're going to do an infrastructure trial, you're going to do that in the PAN training site, and you can create your own sample sessions using the sample students that are already loaded into PAN, the PAN training site. And you're able to conduct that infrastructure trial at any time. If you need more assistance in doing an infrastructure trial, you can reach out to Pearson and they can help you with that as well. And you can see that Stephanie linked the PAN training site here. It's important to note that the PAN training site doesn't contain any active student PII. It's all fake made up data that allows you to create the sessions and conduct infrastructure trials to determine if your school has enough bandwidth.
Just a note, Chelsea, I'm not sure that LEAs in schools can see all of the sample students in PAN. They may need to create sample students, and folks can also use, I think this question was asked in the technology training, you can use your own students' data in the PAN training site to conduct the infrastructure trial if that's your preference. There's no policy against that, just making sure that you are following all applicable DC regulations regarding like student privacy, data privacy. But just note that you can use your own students' information in the training site to conduct an infrastructure trial if that's your preference. But you can also create sample students or fake student data to put in there just to test your systems.
All right, any other questions? Nope. I have one here.
Yeah.
What guidance can we provide to schools regarding the appropriate timelines for preparing test sessions, starting sessions, unlocking units, and locking units? So as far as preparing test sessions go, you're not going to be able to officially prepare and associate those forms for accommodations until the end of March. So you can communicate to your schools that they just need to ensure that their SRP and P information is up to date before that March 30th window, but they can still create sessions. They can still assign test administrators. They just won't be able to do the preparing of the sessions and associating the forms in PAN until March 30th. You're not going to want to start test sessions until the day of testing. So that would probably be on your test coordinator or potentially your technology coordinator to start your test sessions. Same with unlocking. Depending on how your schools are handling the unlocking procedures, that could fall to your test administrators or your testing coordinators. So that would also be, the timeline for that would really just be when the students are at their testing locations, secure materials are at the testing locations, and administration can begin. And then locking units, you want to make sure that units are locked at the end of each testing session. If there's any disruption as far as breaks or lunch and things like that, you want to make sure you also lock your testing units. Unit follow-up to schools start all their test sessions on the first day of their test window. I don't know the answer to that one. Stephanie, do you have guidance on what they've done in the past?
I would need to take that back. My assumption is that you don't actually start the test sessions until the day that you are planning to administer them. So if, yeah, we'll take that back to Pearson, but I think that starting a test session is something that should just occur like the morning of that actual test session.
I have another question here. Let me scroll back up. When will LEAs receive test materials for students who may be taking the test on paper? Great question. So all of the paper materials are currently being printed by Pearson as we speak, according to what was put in your SRP and P as far as students who needed paper. So those are expected to ship to schools within this week. And we are hoping that they will be received by your schools early next week. Coincidentally, next week is also the window for additional paper orders. So if you missed the deadline for the first auto paper order window, you can now go in next Monday and put in a work order for any additional materials that you need. And those work orders will have to be approved by somebody at ussie or Pearson and then shipped to you hopefully as soon as possible. But there'll be a more definitive timeline as you receive like FedEx labels for shipping notifications. Good question. Natalie also asked, if we have students working remotely, how are we expected to manage test security? Do you have any guidance around this matter? So as far as remote testing, that's not something that is offered currently for DC assessments. Stephanie, I didn't know if you wanted to speak to this a little bit more.
Yes, thanks. As communicated in our participation and performance policy for this year, all testing, statewide testing in 22 is going to be conducted in person. If you do have students who are participating in 100% distance learning, the expectation is that LEAs make arrangements to have them come into a building to take the assessments. So we can, ussie can provide support in talking through options that there are for that, but all students must come into a building in order to take the assessments. There is no remote administration this year.
All right. Now, Victoria, you mentioned that you train schools on how to bulk start test sessions. Oh, yeah. So if that's something that DCPS has done in the past, you can start and stop bulk sessions as you've done previously for the day or for the week, but we'll still clarify that with Pearson what the expectation is and what is probably best practice. Any other questions? All right. Well, as always, you can reach out to any member of the ussie staff utilizing any of our contact information Again, you can reach out to the ussie.assessment@dc.gov inbox, and that way you will get your message filtered to the appropriate person on the team. Again, I am Chelsea Charlin. I'm in charge of the DC Science aspect of our administration, and then Yolanda Barber is overseeing our PARCC and Math administration. So if you have any questions specific to PARCC, DC Science, or PAN, you are more than welcome to reach out to either Yolanda or myself if you feel more comfortable doing that. If nobody has any other questions, if no one, Stephanie, did you want to mention anything else?
Yep, just one more note on something that you mentioned earlier, Chelsea, about communications during the test window. It is very much strongly preferred that if you do have questions that are not emergency questions during the test window, please submit a ticket via the OSSI support tool as opposed to email, because our team's email boxes tend to get flooded with emails during administration, and we want to make sure that we aren't missing things. And the best way to do that is for you to submit a ticket to OSSI support tool, which will provide us notification and have a running record of follow-up if needed. The other thing I would say about the OSSI support tool is it is a quick base application. Access to the OSSI support tool is managed by a different team in OSSI. It is not managed by the assessment team. If you are an LEA test coordinator and you do not have access to the OSSI support tool, you should reach out to your LEA data manager, who can submit a request to provide you access to the OSSI support tool. But that is the primary way to get in touch with the assessment team during administration. There is also the OSSI hotline for emergency issues during administration. That hotline is active. I'm not sure we said, but the hotline is active Monday through Friday from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. And there will be someone on the other end to help with any emergency issues that happen. But again, just want to thank you for all of the work that you've put in. I know there are a lot of steps to get ready for administration. We really, truly do appreciate all of the hard work and logistics that you all are working on to make sure that we are ready for a successful administration. Again, please feel free to reach out if you do have questions. And I'm seeing a request for a link to the OSSI support tool. And there you go. Thank you, Chelsea. Just taking a look to see if there are any final questions in the chat. If a student is taking MSAA.
Yeah, sorry. If we have a student taking the MSAA here, and if they, for whatever reason, don't take it on the specific date that's on our plan, will we have to report that as a minor deviation?
Yes, we do ask that you update test schedules to reflect the actual testing dates.
Got it.
Yeah, the minor deviation doesn't apply just to PARCC and DC Science. So any assessment that you're administering that we have here at OSSI, you could do a minor deviation for any sort of change in individual student sessions. All right, so I think that might be it. We thank you again for coming to this session, and we've dropped some links and some emails in the chat. So if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us. And no problem, Natalie. And hopefully you have the rest of the good day and enjoy our spring administration when it opens. Thanks, everyone.